appreciation for all of you. I don't know you, but I do know this about you. You're doing this class, and you're talking about studying through the Bible over the course of a year, and I want to honor that. I really appreciate that commitment. I know that's not a simple thing. I know that Yo has a real passion for this and understands how to do it and how to lead it. But it doesn't happen without your heart and your willingness, and ultimately your hard work. It's not a simple matter. But on the other hand, I think you will find that it will pay rich dividends. And to me, studying the Bible is such a powerful and rich thing, and it's largely a lost thing anymore, even and maybe especially among Christians. So I'm picking up in the middle. My task is to do most of the book of Numbers today. And so first of all, a little context. So you all have the outlines? Okay. So I'll be sticking fairly closely to the outline. Where did they go?
Yeah, everybody has one. Sorry, don't. I missed Don and Linda. Oh my gosh.
I know,
right.
we're so far away.
Let's make sure everybody's got an outline. Oh, more and more. We're running out. One over here.
Yeah, all right. Just go ahead and keep going, Mark.
Okay, so first of all, you always want to think of what you're studying in the Bible in context. It's hard to understand any particular text you're reading without having a good sense of context. That is, where does it fit? Where does it fit in the overall Bible, and where does the passage you're dealing with fit within an overall text or within the writings of a particular author or something like that? So the big context here is really the heart of the Bible is what you call in Hebrew the Torah, the law. These are the first 5 books. So in a sort of anglicized Greek, we refer to it as Pentateuch. Right? Have you heard this term, Pentateuch? So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So we're in number 4, and you've already done 3. So give me a big picture of what you've done, Genesis through Leviticus. What major themes have you explored thus far? This is your test. You didn't know there was going to be a pop quiz, did you? See, I'm a college professor. I do these things. Pop quizzes.
God is holy.
God is holy. Okay. Just,
Merciful.
Merciful. Very good.
Leading his people to have an identity.
Ah, good. The shaping of identity. Anything else? Major themes you've been exploring?
Giving them, laying down rules and regulations as they come together as a nation.
All right, rules and regulations so that they're not identity as individuals, but as a group. Okay, good. Anything else?
The laws regarding sacrifices, or the
Yes. Sorry?
worship.
How to worship, yeah, okay.
All things lead to Jesus.
All things lead to Jesus, okay. Good. Okay, so you've got some major themes going on here. Now I'll give you here's my big picture of what's going on. And I look at it, there's this wonderful book written by a friend of mine called The Story of God. I don't know if you've ever seen this. The Story of God. And in The Story of God, when you think of it, that's what the Bible is, right? It's the story of God. In particular, it's the story of God's revelation to us, and it's the story of human interaction with God. So that's what it means by the story of God. So here's my big picture for what it's worth. In a sense, this story has 2 chapters. The first chapter is Genesis 1 and 2, and the rest of it is the rest. Right? And that is, right, you have Adam and Eve and all the potential they represented in this creation made good. And then in Genesis 3, you have the fall of Adam and Eve and bringing down with them and creating distance between God and humanity. And then you have everything else. Right?
Sorry.
That's right. So there is, so now let me take a step back. There's this really interesting verse. I don't know if you paid any attention to it or not. I know I'm supposed to be talking about numbers, but I'll get there in a minute. In Genesis chapter 3, you have this whole story of Adam and Eve and the eating of the fruit and the curse and the fig leaves and all that sort of stuff. And then you have this very interesting verse. It says, after the curses and kicking them out of the Garden of Eden and all that sort of stuff, God comes to Adam and Eve and he gives them clothes made of skin. Did you notice that? To me, that's one of the most important verses in the Bible. And the reason is this. When you think of it logically, God created the world good. He created humans in his own image. There's all this potential. He created humans with a purpose to respond freely to him in love, and they chose not to. At this point, the most logical conclusion, the Bible should have been very short, just a couple of chapters, and God saw that it was bad, and he wiped out humanity. Right? The end. That's the most logical thing to have happened. Humans transgressed. This experiment in creating humans to respond freely to God in love failed. So wipe it out and start over. The very fact that God chose not to do that is why we have everything else. Right? And the idea that God, this is really interesting. Adam and Eve, the very first thing they do after they eat the forbidden fruit, what? They put on clothes. That means we are meant to be naked. Nudist colonies are God's will. I just want to be clear about this. Right? The very first thing they do is put on fig leaves. That is the symbol of their sin. Clothing. When God did not say, rip off that clothing, stop doing that, what did God do? He gave them clothing that would last. Right? Instead of giving him new fig leaves, right? He gave them clothing that would last. I think that statement when he says God gave them garments of skin, God is saying in extraordinary mercy, I'm going to decide not to destroy you. I'm going to decide instead to work with you where you are right now, and I know you're sinful, and I'm going to work from there. Because now I want to redeem you. Right? I want to bring you back. And giving them permanent clothes is a way of saying, I know it's going to take a while. Right? This is not a simple matter. I just think it's beautiful. So it sets everything up. So what we have in the story of God then, beginning with giving them garments of skin, is okay, how? How is God going to work to restore humanity? And if you will, redemptive strategy 1 is simply to say, I will take you back, to offer grace. I will take you back. And basically up through chapter 11, God is saying to humanity, I will take you back if you will come back in repentance and faith. If you come back, I will grant you grace. And humans decide by and large, no, they don't want that. He even tries judgment, right? In the flood, get rid of at least the worst ones and work with the ones who are left over, and they still, by and large, uninterested. And so Genesis 12, the story changes. God decides this idea of offering all of humanity free and open grace. Humans aren't responding very well to that. Let's go to plan B. Plan B, well, I guess this is plan C, isn't it? Because plan B would have been the first couple of chapters. Plan C, then, is how about one family? Can we make it work for one family? So it goes to Abraham, right? And you have this wonderful image. God comes out of nowhere for no particular reason that's mentioned. God comes to Abraham and says, go to the place I will show you. And then he makes promises, right? If you respond in this little way, I will make you have great descendants. I will bless those who bless you. And thirdly, and very importantly, through you and your descendants, all peoples will be blessed. So the idea then is God is going to concentrate on one family as an instrument of blessing to the world. Not exclusively on one family, but focus on one family, because at least by working on one family then, in a sense, he can concentrate his efforts and hopefully shape a people who will respond freely to God in love through whom then other people will be drawn in and blessing will come to the whole world. That's chapter 12. We've only gotten to Genesis chapter 12. Now we need to get to Leviticus. What we get with Abraham is beginning with the concept of chosen people. Chosen people. As we move forward in the Pentateuch, we add to the idea of chosen people, promised land. So chosen people and promised land are going to be two of the elements of the story of God. This, if you will, redemptive strategy 2. This focus on one family, ultimately shaping this family into a nation, loosely speaking, a country, a political entity, and putting them in a place. But the place is simply to be the place where this family is shaped to respond freely to God in love. Redemptive strategy 2 is going to continue. That's the rest of the Old Testament. Right? God's going to continue to work with this family, etc. And ultimately, that strategy fails. Or at least it heavily fails. It doesn't entirely fail, but it fails enough that God turns to redemptive strategy 3, which is Jesus. Right? And so you get, that's New Testament. So that's my big that's my big picture. Now you don't need to take this class. You don't need to study the rest of the Bible. You now know the whole thing. There it is. You always think, shut up, don't say that. No, you do. You need to, it's fun stuff. So now Numbers is the book that, if you will, geographically takes us from Sinai to the Promised Land. Okay, it's the movements. So we've already been from Egypt to Sinai, and now we go from Sinai to the Promised Land, and then with Deuteronomy we enter, right, and they move into the land. So, now let's stop for a moment and ask two questions about this. I'm an archaeologist, so I'm a professor of history. But I'm one of the directors of an archaeological excavation in Israel, so I do archaeology. I realize that there's been lots and lots of stuff done, mainly in film, about a relationship between archaeology and the Exodus and Sinai and that stuff. Because all those things are around and they're fairly popular in certain Christian circles, I wanted to just take a moment with you and reflect on that movement. When you think of it, what is the Exodus? The Exodus is a bunch of people moving, and according to the biblical story, what do? They leave Egypt, they go to Sinai, wherever that is, they wander around in the wilderness for 40 years, and then they enter the Promised Land. So what would you expect to see archaeologically? Because in archaeology, you dig up people's trash, right? You dig up material culture. You dig up cities where people lived, and you examine these things with great care. What would you expect to see of the Exodus? The simple answer is nothing. You wouldn't expect to see anything, would you? Because after all, people who are nomads, they don't build cities. They're not building permanent structures that would last that later archaeologists can dig up. They're wandering around. People who wander around, whatever trash they leave behind is organic and it disintegrates and we don't have it. So you wouldn't expect to see anything. Also, it's very important, you wouldn't expect to have any records of this from Egypt. Because when ancient kings write down records, they write down about their victories. They talk about all the great things they did. This is embarrassing to the Egyptians. They would never write down such a thing. So the idea that the Egyptians didn't write anything down about this, ancient monarchies don't write stories about their slaves. And they don't write stories about an embarrassment when a bunch of people leave their country. So we would not expect to see anything in writing. We wouldn't expect to see any archaeology, and therefore, and this is what you get in all these films and discussions, etc., they are actually not talking about archaeology at all. And so I just want to be fair about this, that any of these reconstructions could be correct. What they're usually doing is technically a comparison between biblical text and geographical features. That's usually what most of these films do, and they're trying to figure out a route that would make sense and fit with this part of the text or that part of the text. But they're not actually doing archaeology. Archaeology, you go to a city and you excavate the structures that are there and you analyze the pottery and the burials and the material culture that you find in these areas. And of course, you can't do that with anything about the Exodus. Now, there is one thing you would expect to see from the Exodus. There's one thing you would expect to see archaeologically. You got a bunch of people moving, they land somewhere. So you would expect to see population influx somewhere. In archaeology, you don't see population loss usually, right? Because you still have the buildings there. But when people move into an area, if you have a whole bunch of people move into Kona, you would see it, right? They have to live somewhere. So they are going to build stuff. And what do you see in Israel? That's exactly what you see. You see a significant population influx. In fact, recent archaeology has archaeological work done in the highlands north of Jerusalem and south of the Sea of Galilee, which would be the lousy land in Israel. Major population influx, about 100 new villages within 100 years are built in that area. So that's what you would expect to see. You would expect to see new people coming in and going to the place that's not the good land, because the good land's already taken, right? So they would go to the lousy land and they would build stuff because they have to have a place to live. So we do see that. We do see some destruction of places in Israel, so burn layers at cities, especially Chatzor. So my point is, don't expect to see much. But what you would expect to see, in fact, you see, at least hints. Not very much, but enough to make a certain amount of sense. So then the big question, where was Mount Sinai? Right? If we're talking here in our text about Mount Sinai, where was it? The answer is, we don't know. Okay, we don't know, and we're not going to know, because by the nature of the beast, we just don't have enough information. I'm an ancient historian. So what is ancient history? Ancient history is we're doing a 1,000-piece puzzle, and we have 100 pieces. Okay? And that's what archaeology is. Now, it's not that you have no pieces. You have 100 pieces. But try to do a 1,000-piece puzzle without 900 of the pieces. Oh, no, by the way, you don't have the picture either. Right? So you're going to make sense out of the relationship among those pieces, and you're going to do the best job you can. So that's what we do in archaeology. That's what we do in ancient history. We have 100 pieces of the puzzle of where is Mount Sinai, and we can arrange them in certain ways, and it makes sense, say, Jebel Musa, the southern Sinai traditional site, St. Catherine's Monastery. You can arrange them in another way, and a relatively recent argument for a site in Saudi Arabia, kind of western Saudi Arabia. There is one new piece of evidence that might actually be better than any of the others, and that is a place called Har Karkom, which you've probably never heard of, right? Har Karkom, and I have a picture of it here. Har Karkom is a mountain in very southeastern corner of Israel, and it's actually on a military base. I have a friend who excavated there, and this is interesting. What he found there, unlike the other candidates, what he found at this particular site was, like up at Puako, you have petroglyphs, people scratching in the rocks, little pictures. You have a bunch of petroglyphs, ancient petroglyphs all around this mountain. And you have little rock installations, little platforms built up, little altars and little encampments and that sort of stuff. And they date from a fairly large period of time, including around the time traditionally when the Exodus was, at least one of the, well, actually both of the major dates. What we see is evidence of a place that was considered holy. And you have people coming to this place for centuries, over and over again, because they consider this place holy. When you think of the account of Mount Sinai in the Bible, they seem to know where it is. Everybody seems to know where it is, that it was already considered a holy site before the Hebrews went there. And if you know anything about religious anthropology, that makes sense. A holy site is a holy site is a holy site. And you may have religious change take place, but the site remains holy. It's just the gods that are associated with it or the rituals that are associated with it change. But the site continues to remain holy. So it would make sense that they would go to a place that was already considered holy, and there they would meet with their God, right? So I don't know, is this the site? It's something, as opposed to the nothing we have with most other identifications. We actually have something on the ground that refers to people who were there around the time, but also after and also before by quite a period. So is that the site? I don't know, but it's actually a pretty good candidate, and it's not too far from Kadesh Barnea, which also makes a fair amount of sense for this story. So geographically with the text, it fits reasonably well with a northern theory of the Exodus. Anyhow, we could go back and forth over all the different theories that are there. I would just say that from an archaeological point of view, they're all pretty much equally possible. And they're all pretty much equally lacking in evidence. And you do what you can. You arrange the 100 pieces and try to make the most sense you can. And after all, nobody's faith depends on understanding properly the route of the Exodus or whatever, the identification of Mount Sinai. Also, let's bear in mind that we have sources being used here as this text is written. Some of them are named, some of them are not. It's not entirely clear. And I'm sure you've talked about sources in other texts in the Pentateuch, and you'll be able to do that when you talk later. And many will be named, you'll pay attention to. There'll be a reference to a particular source that's being used, and the sources may be oral, the sources may be written. Here, we clearly, overwhelmingly have sources that come from a priestly perspective, right? You get genealogies, you get people counts, kind of official record keeping. You've got references to lots of rituals, right? Cleanliness, ritual purity, rituals, and that sort of stuff. This is all priestly stuff, right? Priests are interested in this stuff. And oh, by the way, the major theme in this passage that we're dealing with is priests, right? The importance of Levites, the importance of Aaron and Moses, their family, is a primary theme in this text. So clearly and when you think about it, it makes sense. Priests probably keep a lot of records. So to have that kind of material available. And the traditional authorship is Moses. He's from the tribe of Levi, right? So that makes good sense. So anyhow, that's what we see generally in terms of sources. Now let's go to the content of this text. And the first part of it, of course, you probably found eminently tedious, right? Going through all these census numbers and counts of the different tribes and so on. And so we have census information, we have genealogy information in chapters 1 through 4. This is interesting stuff in a tedious way, and if you're really interested in looking at details, that's kind of cool. But this chapter, okay, so this book is called Numbers. Why is it called Numbers? Because there's lots and lots of numbers in that section. So I figure if we're going to be studying the book of Numbers, I ought to explain to you something about Hebrew numbers. Okay? So, when you encounter numbers in the Old Testament, they are being written in Hebrew. There are no Arabic numerals. When you encounter numbers in the Hebrew Bible, ask yourself several questions. We Americans, because we're used to using Arabic numerals, and we are not used to any symbolic value to numbers by and large, except for number 1, right? We're number 1. Other than the number 1, we are not used to any thinking in terms. So we automatically assume a literal reading of numbers. Hebrews would automatically assume a non-literal reading of numbers. And so because of that, we have a little bit of a communication gap that we have to deal with. So there are occasions when Hebrews use numbers literally, but they're actually relatively few. And if you take a literal reading of this text, we have 603,000 plus men, not counting women and children, which makes this Hebrew group undergoing the Exodus about 2 million people. Okay? Now, if you take that literally, that's one heck of a lot of people. And the implications of moving that group of people, for example, it would take, I think, 12 weeks to cross the Red Sea. When you start thinking about what that actually means, it starts to become hard to imagine. And also, if you try to imagine what it looks like for 2 million people to move into the land of Israel, there's about 8 million people in the land of Israel right now. Okay? It is much more congested than Honolulu.
Oh, yeah.
To get that, Israel is really heavily built up. That's why there's controversy about West Bank settlements and all that, because it's not very much land and it's lots of people. If you took 2 million people in the ancient world and added them in there, you'd have modern metropolis going on. You'd have to accommodate that many people. So scholars, when they've looked at these numbers, have said, okay, I mean, you could take these numbers literally because they are precise numbers, but if you do, there are implications, right? This is a really, really big number of people. But remember that Hebrews generally don't take numbers literally. So the intent of the ancient authors typically was something else. So, so I'll try to explain to you so that when you read throughout your Old Testament and you run into numbers, you'll at least ask this set of questions. So here are the other ways that Hebrews look at numbers. One is they love symbolic numbers. They love the number 7, the number of perfection, right? They love the number 10, the 10 commandments, etc. They love the number 12, right? The 12 tribes, etc. And they love to play with multiples of those numbers. So watch how often in the Bible the numbers are multiples of 7, multiples of 10, multiples of 12, and pay attention to that. And when you pay attention to that, think like a Hebrew. Oh, okay, they're playing with the numbers. These are multiples of perfection, and smile. Right? That's what they want you to, if that would be the author's intent. If they're using a multiple of 7 in there, this is multiples of perfection. Okay, that's kind of fun, and you smile. Okay, I know what you're doing. And that's the author's intent. Okay, multiples of 10, they love that kind of stuff. So yes.
I noticed when they were describing the tribes in Abram, one of them had bring forth offerings, or there was 5 mentioned a lot.
Yeah, and I've not studied that one, so I can't tell you. But you're right. There are the number 5 is played with a fair amount. Christians, of course, will play with 3s later on. Hebrews, not so much. But anyhow, so just pay attention. If you have multiples of 7, or like the famous 666 in the New Testament, right? Well, that's 1 short of 7, right? So this is the number of imperfection. It's man's number. It even says in the book of Revelation, specifically speaks of the symbolic value of the number. There's probably literal value of that number too, although there's debates about the identification. So that's one way the numbers are used in the Hebrew Bible. So pay attention to those multiples. Second, there are what's called gematria. So there is no such thing as Arabic numerals. They don't exist yet. So when you want to write a number in Hebrew, how can I say? It would be like, okay, so the Hebrew letter Aleph equals 1. Beit equals 2. So this is the alphabet, and this letter has also a numerical value. So if you have the term Av, which means father, that numerical value is 3. Right? You add the numbers together, and you get a numerical equivalent for that word. This is what's called gematria. So Hebrew's like that. By the way, the 666 in the book of Revelation, at least one, this is confusing, but if you take the name Kaiser Neron in Greek, transliterate that into Hebrew, and do this, you end up with 666. Okay, so that's probably the most and I think that actually is the proper, I think that's what's intended in that particular place. So that's gematria. Okay. Oh, by the way, what happens when you get to 10? So you have at Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, whatever, they go up to 9. When you get to 10, that's Yod, and Yod equals 10. And so when you want to do 11, it's Yod Aleph. Okay, so if that makes, and there's a 20 and a 30 and so on. So you can do all that using the alphabet. By the way, this also works in Greek, so that you have numerical equivalents. Because again, you either have to spell out the name of the number or use the letter. Those are the only 2 ways you can. And by the way, when you do Greek math and try not to use Arabic numerals and use letters to do math, it kind of gives you a headache. Okay, so that's gematria. Now, there's one other problem. Now, by the way, in numbers, because of the nature of the numbers we have, they're not multiples of 7, 10, or 12, and they are not, there's no way you could do gematria on them and make it work. So those explanations work a lot in the Old Testament, but they don't work in this census, in numbers. But there is another issue that does work, and that is the Aleph problem in Hebrew. Aleph is a word which means, and it can be used as the number 1,000, or it can refer to a one leader. So it either means 1,000 or a leader. Or it could mean both 1,000 and a leader, which gets really confusing, which actually I think may be going on here. So, when you read this number, so the number 53,400 in Hebrew is 53 alephs, 400. So a literal reading would be 53 leaders and 400 men. In other words, 453 total people. Unless the 53 are actually part of the 400. But probably not. So instead of being 53,400, you've in fact, the count is 453. Does that make sense? Or to put it another way, move the decimal point over 3 places, and you're pretty close. That works, and that is how Hebrews use numbers in a lot of places. So when you got really big numbers and you see them and you say, "Ooh, I'm not sure about that number. Seems way big." Move the decimal over 3 places and see what you've got, and if you do that, you've got the Aleph thing going on. If that makes sense, or Aleph could mean both a leader and 1,000 men, in which case 53,400, that number would be 52 Alephs, leaders, and then Aleph used again, 400, so 1,400. Okay, so you would have 52 leaders and 1,400 men. Are you getting a headache?
Could it also mean 51 leaders and 2,400 men?
Say that again?
Could it also mean 51 leaders and 24?
No, unless you had an extra Aleph in there. You need an extra Aleph to make that work. So it would have to say, 53 Aleph, 400 to make that one work. So if it could, theoretically it could, but you'd need 2 Alephs in there. So my point is that there's lots of possibilities. The Aleph issue, by the way, will help a lot when you've got these really big numbers and you think this seems kind of wild. And so if you roughly estimate by moving the decimal point over 3 places and try to imagine that now, right, instead of 2 million people, you've got 2,000 people, or actually if you had, for one tribe, 52 leaders and 1,400 men, that's 1 out of 12, right? So you're talking about maybe 40, 50,000 people altogether, if that's, that starts to seem much more fitting with the story that we're being told, and also fitting with what we see, for example, on the other end with the settlements that come in, and that sort of stuff, that we don't have this gigantic mob coming in. But we have a decent-sized group. We have 100 new villages being founded in that area. So anyhow, these are possibilities at least. This is one of the things that is helpful at least to think through. And what, our question always, when we're studying the ancient world, and especially when we're studying the Bible, we have an ancient person writing from an ancient perspective, being understood by ancient people from an ancient perspective. We want to understand the intent of the original author relative to the original audience and how the original audience would understand this. And the original audience knows all these things, and they're expecting to see gematria. They're expecting to see alephs used in this way. They're expecting to see symbolic use of numbers, so we should expect it as well. That's all. Which one it is at any given moment, you just got to try them out, I think, and see which one seems to fit in with the text in context. That make sense? Does that sound like anything else that you guys do with it? Okay. All right, we need a boogie. So now to chapters 5 through 10. We have a bunch of purity laws. So you probably recognize some of these things. These same kind of purity laws that you got in Leviticus, right? So these are these ritual identity of the people and setting them apart as holy. Holy people to represent a holy God. Rather nice. I love the laws of jealousy, right? If a man thinks his wife is committed adultery, this is very interesting. This may seem kind of ridiculous, and it may seem kind of a witch hunt kind of thing, but recognize the alternative. If they did not have this law, the law is the man accuses the woman of adultery and has her stoned. Okay? So this is a way of saying, no, don't stone her. Let's do this instead. Right? So this is very merciful if you will, relative to the alternative, which would be stoning. And by the way, right, you have this dust and you put it in the water and you drink it, the probability is that most people will pass that test. Right? It's only the ones who don't pass that test, right, who become consumed, their thigh wastes away, and whatever, are only the ones who then are shown to be guilty by this particular, what we call ordeal, this set it up for judgment by God. So the idea is, nobody should get sick by doing this, naturally. It would only be if God is demonstrating this person is guilty that the person be found guilty. So this will exonerate a whole lot of women from jealousy. So it's rather an interesting law. The Nazirite vow is kind of a nice one. If you are just, there's something that is, you are taking deeply seriously and you want to make it a very, very serious vow, the Nazirite vow is there. Paul does something of the sort in the book of Acts, takes a Nazirite vow. And then we have this whole business about the Levites being set apart. They're not going to get land, but they have particular roles, and they are holier in a way than the other people. They're set apart to do this special job, to lead in the tabernacle's worship. There's the consecration of the tabernacle, the first Passover, which is a priestly celebration, including the sacrifice of the Passover lamb, etc. Then we have the movement from Sinai to Kadesh, chapters 10 through 12, in the process of which the people start to whine. Lots and lots of whining. They are quailing about quail. Isn't that good? Quailing about quail. Even Miriam and Aaron get tired of doing what Moses tells them to do, and they stand up against him for a short time. You have then in chapter 13 this sending out of the spies. And then they come back with this report, and all but two of them say, too scary. We don't want to go there. Those people were big. They're scary people. We don't want to go deal with them. All except for Joshua and Caleb, who say, scary, yes, but with God on our side, we can do it, was basically what they said. Because of the spies' mixed report, the entry into the promised land is put off. The people, God says, go. I'm guiding you into the promised land. And the people largely, with a few exceptions, the people say no. Too scary. Because of that, they are cursed, or if you will, they follow the natural consequences of their behavior, namely they don't go. They don't go in, but they can't go back to Egypt either. So what do? They wander in the wilderness until they die off, except for those who wanted to go in. We also then have, so here we have, interestingly, the promised land. God has promised it. God is prepared to deliver. The people aren't prepared to accept. Interesting concept. God is prepared to deliver. The people aren't prepared to accept. So instead, they spend the rest of their life wandering in the wilderness and then die. It's kind of a sad thing. We have Korah's rebellion. So here's another rebellion against Moses' leadership and the idea of the Levites being set apart by God. We have another tension arising about, why should we follow Moses and Aaron? Why should the Levites have this special position? And so we have that marvelous sort of contest of the staves of the different tribes and then Aaron's staff buds. So notice, please, this is why I talked about there being a priestly perspective in all this. This whole section are a whole series of affirmations of God affirming the special place of the Levites. They are to be the ones to lead, and they're the ones to who are set apart to lead in worship in the tabernacle. Over and over again, God is affirming that leadership. Very interestingly, Korah, he wants a democracy. Did you notice that? Korah is your first democratic leader. Right? Korah comes up and says, hey, we're all people. We're all set apart by God. We're all holy. We should all have a voice in this thing. And God responds by opening up the earth and swallowing it. So anyhow, your first attempt at democracy didn't go so well. God didn't set up a democracy, right? That's not what this That's not what this situation is about. He set up a theocracy, right, where God is leading, and the instruments through which God primarily leads are those who are set apart for the job, namely Moses, Aaron, and the Levites. So that's the big picture, the overall picture of the book of Numbers. And so now let's go back and look at this in terms of the story of God. Right? Here is God, whose covenant objective with his people is always to call them back to respond freely to him in love. How can that happen with one extended family becoming a political entity eventually? The only way that's going to happen is if you have consecrated leadership and holiness. Right? If God can build into them consecrated leadership and holiness so that God's word can get to the people unadulterated, then the people are in a position to respond freely to God in love. But if you have constant complaining, if you have rebellions against the consecrated leadership, if you have unholiness by staying away from the guidance of the Levites, etc., if you have those things going on, people will not respond freely to God in love. So God is shaping these people through all this series of events, shaping them to be prepared as they must when they enter the promised land. Because when they enter the promised land, things aren't going to get easier, they're going to get harder. And they've got to work together under God's leadership, or when they enter the land, they're simply going to get snuffed out. Because who's in the land? This is a good land. That means there's powerful people there. They like it, they're already inhabiting it, and if the Hebrews don't get their act together, they're going to walk in there and get squashed. So part of what you can see with the book of Numbers is a sort of boot camp. It's preparing the people to be together and get their focus straight, get their focus on God, so when they go to the promised land, they will be able to receive the promise and not just walk into a place where they're going to get squished. So, conclusions. God has called his people. He's called them to be his chosen people. He's called them to have an identity separate from other people, and that identity is focused on their relationship with God, to be a people who respond freely to God in love. They are called through that identity to be a blessing to all people. That's a constant. That just runs through the entire Hebrew Bible. There are political consequences, there are economic consequences, and very importantly, there are ethical consequences, right? They ought to behave in certain ways. That's why you have your 10 commandments and ultimately 613 commandments. They're called to behave in a certain way because behaving in that certain way is consistent with responding, but they have to do so freely. They need to be responding freely to God in love. God is not going to make them, but he is going to guide them. So they have a divine call, and the centerpiece, of course, in this book is they are called to, just like Abraham was, called to go to the land God is pointing them. He has promised them this land. They're called to go and inhabit that land as the people of God. And they say no. It is a land flowing with milk and honey. Anybody ever been in the Sinai? It is a desolate, desolate place. Now, if you've been to Israel, parts of it are desolate too, but nothing like the Sinai. Sinai, there's no water. It's beautiful in certain ways, the beautiful rock formations, etc. But it's a place to go and die. It is not a place to thrive and prosper. And by the way, almost nobody lives there to this day because of that. It's just rough. You can't live there. It's not a good place to live. You will never prosper there. Israel has plentiful water. It's got forests. It's got good agricultural land. It's got lots and lots of opportunities. So you got to think not in terms of Hawaii. It's not lush, but you got to think in terms of, as opposed to a stark desert, that land is beautiful. There is immense potential there. It is lovely. God is saying, look, it's beautiful. It's yours. Go. Take it. I'll lead you. And the people say, nah, it looks awful scary to me. There are too many obstacles in the way. And ultimately what they're saying is, we don't trust you, God, to lead us there. Those guys are big. We think they can beat us up. So, when you think of it, human fear it's a powerful thing. I sort of joke with my students regularly. One of the great if you ever want to do political analysis, if you ever want to understand ancient governments, etc., there's a very important rule. It's easier to be feared than to be loved. It's easier to be feared than to be loved. You can govern by fear, you can govern by love, but it's always easier to engender fear. So if you ever want to understand why political culture is as confusing as it is in our country, it's because fear is easy. You can make people afraid. This is why negative advertising always works. So we all hate it, but negative advertising always works because it's easier to make people afraid than to make people hopeful. The Hebrew people became afraid, enough of them, and fear is contagious, right? Once you get a couple people afraid, fear becomes contagious. And by the way, people who act out of fear almost always do the wrong thing. But fear it's us, it's in us, it runs through us, so we can certainly resonate with the idea of, this looks scary. God, you calling me there? Really? Is it really you, God, or am I just imagining this? Those guys look awfully scary. And ultimately, there's this question. I suppose there's this question of discernment. Is this really God speaking? And that's probably why they were sort of rebelling against Moses. Why should we listen to Moses? Maybe we should listen to Korah. Maybe Korah has a better way of doing this. But human fear has its consequences. If we act according to fear, we cease to act according to principle. And if we act according to fear, we are going to keep acting according to fear. And what does acting according to fear mean? It means you avoid, right? I don't want this to happen. 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 So where do I go? I'm never going towards something. I'm always going away from something. If we live by fear, we're always in retreat. We're never going forward, and thus things can never get better if we live according to fear. So human fear has its consequences, and it's not just for them, it's for us. But we got to be honest with ourselves. The idea of going forward into the unknown is always frightening. The idea, even if it looks really good, there's all those what ifs. And anybody who's a good planner, I was academic vice president at my college for 10 years. And if you're going to be an academic vice president, you always have to think way ahead, and you always have to think in terms of what can go wrong. So I spent my life thinking about what can go wrong. Well, I spent 10 years of my life thinking about what can go wrong. Now, that's okay, because that doesn't have to inspire fear. If you're thinking about what can go wrong, you can also think about what can go right. And if I think far enough ahead about what can go wrong, I can make a plan to make it not go wrong. And that's good planning. If you're acting according to fear, it's really hard to do any planning, because you never know when the next fear is going to deflect you. But let's be fair, we all have a lot of fear. We live in a world that's scary and out of our control in many ways, and that fear will always have its consequences. But fear doesn't get the last word. Yeah, fear is a challenge. We feel it. It has consequences. But fear in this story does not have the last word. Those people are going to the promised land, despite their fears. God is going to guide them there. But in order for God to be able to guide them there, in order for them to be willing freely to follow God into the promised land, all that group that's going to make its decisions by fear, they have to go away. Only the next generation. That's why we so need young people to be coming forward. It's only the young people who have the courage to say, you know, it's worth a shot. It's worth a shot. I see hope there. I see opportunity there. I think that land is awfully nice. And those big guys, if we really trust God, if we really work together, I think we can take them. Isn't that what it takes to do anything great? Fear doesn't have the last word. What has the last word? Grace. Over and over again, the story of God is the story of grace. Humans get fearful, humans get stupid, humans get rebellious, and over again, God's saying, okay, you idiots, let's try again. Look, promised land, you can do it. Will you respond this time? Because if you do, together, we can go there, and it's going to be great. I'd like to conclude with chapter 6. Just kind of in the middle, kind of out of the nowhere, in chapter 6, we had this wonderful little blessing. Appropriately, a priestly blessing. And notice, so the Lord says to Moses, tell Aaron and his sons, this is how to bless the people of Israel. So this is God telling Aaron, here's how you want to bless the people. And just a couple of words of explanation. So here's the blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. Hearkening back to the blessing, the Lord bless you and keep you. Hearkening back to that great blessing from Abraham. I love this. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Can you see the picture? God's kind of scary, right? God's big and powerful. And the idea that God, especially if we've done something wrong, if we are fearful or have done something wrong or whatever, there's a sense of which you kind of don't want to look at God's face. And if you look at God's face, maybe he'll be frowning. Maybe he'll be angry. Maybe he'll be stern, right? The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Can you picture it? Looking at his face and expecting a frown and seeing a smile. Expecting to see a closed fist and meeting an open hand. What a beautiful picture. And ultimately, if you do that, the Lord will turn his face toward you and give you what? Peace. So, let me offer you the ancient blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace, now and forever. Amen.
Where was Korah's rebellion? I seem to have missed that name.
Korah's rebellion is like about 16, chapter 16.
I read that too quick.
He's the guy that, remember the ground opening up and swallowing the guys?
Oh, yeah.
That's that.
Oh.
Yep, chapter 16.
Okay.
So that's the end of the story. The beginning of the story is, hey, this is kind of interesting. He rose up against Moses with 250 guys. They came as a group to oppose Moses and Aaron and said, you've gone too far. The whole community is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is with them. That's what I meant by that. So the democratic challenge, if you will, that every one of them is holy. So why should we listen to you?
Yeah, is there merit to the suggestion that the larger number, maybe a couple of million, is based on the number of generations during which the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, there are 10 or 11 generations. They started with 70 or however many people it was. Conceivably, there could have been as many as maybe a couple of million in that period of time, or is that not?
If they were unbelievably fruitful. Yeah. Theoretically, if you had enough years, enough generations, and enough lack of infant mortality, and enough, over time, theoretically, it's possible. People have argued about that. It's not that you base the number on that. It's that if you take that number and you work backwards and you judge you have this many kids for this many generations and do the math, you can do the math in a way that ends up with 2 million. But that's assuming that the author intended 2 million, which I'm suggesting probably not. But I don't know. Maybe so. So it's not completely ridiculous out of the realm of possibility.
But not the intent. Maybe.
Right. Yeah, I mean, a lot of times when we're studying the Bible, we have to be confident. I'm an ancient historian, so I'm used to this, but I realize you're probably not. That being comfortable with the fact that what God has revealed is 100 pieces and not 1,000. We kind of have to be okay with that. At least that's kind of my feeling. And okay, so we're not certain of the best the original meaning of a particular thing. We do our best. We seek God's guidance in the situation, and we recognize that for somebody else to disagree or take a different angle or whatever, makes sense given the number of pieces you have. It's
The
okay.
smaller number is a phenomenal miracle. So,
Well, it's survival and escape of the Hebrew. I mean, this is the miracle. The Exodus is the miracle par excellence in the entire Hebrew Bible. Right? It's a shaper of identity. So, yeah, we're not removing the possibility of miracle. It's just what does the author mean in this particular text. Any other questions or comments? Okay, thank you.
I would just like to thank you. You did open up a lot for me personally, so that was worth it.
Thanks.
And as you probably also sense the importance of reading the chapters beforehand. So next week we read chapter 20 to 40. The way we selected the chapters is because in chapter 20 the Jodi, remember they are stuck in the wilderness for 40 years. Yeah. Mark talked about that. But then in chapter 20 the journey resumes, I should say. The journey resumes, and they're heading again towards the promised land. They end up, Mark mentioned Kadesh Barnea, which is where the spies were, but now instead the journey will go to the land of Moab. And so the story is about being in the land of Moab when we come to the end of Numbers. So read chapter 20 to 40, so that we will have again a guest speaker, a good friend of mine, another one coming and teaching us, who's studying in the theological seminary as well in Fuller, in California. In Los Angeles, so, but he lives here, so I don't actually have to fly him in. All right, see you guys next week.
Thank you.